2025, the G20, the club of the world's most powerful economies, did something for the very first time. It held its summit on African soil. Now, this wasn't just a change of scenery. The meeting in Johannesburg, well, it might just be the moment we look back on as the start of a huge shift in the global balance of power. Let's dig into why.
Right from the start, the whole summit was framed by this powerful African philosophy of Ubuntu. Basically, I am because we are. Think about that. In a world that's so often about competition, this idea of shared humanity and interconnectedness set a totally different, much more collaborative tone for a meeting of global heavyweights. Okay, here's the plan for our breakdown today. We're going to start with all the firsts that made this summit so unique. Then, we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of the Johannesburg Declaration. After that, we'll zoom out to see why the G20 actually matters, before looking at the serious cracks in its foundation. And finally, we'll tackle the big one. Are we watching a new world order take shape?
First up, let's talk about what made this summit a real trailblazer. This meeting in Johannesburg was not just business as usual. It really did break new ground in some pretty significant ways.
You see, all these things, the location, the theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainability, and that guiding philosophy of Ubuntu, none of this was an accident. It was a very powerful, very deliberate statement that the priorities of the Global South are no longer just a side conversation. They're moving right to the center of the global stage.
So, great symbolism, right? But what did they actually agree on? The Johannesburg Declaration laid out some really ambitious goals. Let's break down the key commitments that came out of it.
A massive chunk of the declaration was all about leveling the economic playing field. This included a new commission to tackle the absolutely crippling debt costs that developing nations face, an initiative to make sure Africa is a real player in the AI revolution, and a commitment to a global early warning system for disasters.
And if you want to grasp the sheer scale of their ambition, just look at this number, 300 million. That's the target for Mission 300. And this isn't some small pledge. We're talking about a massive joint project to connect 300 million people in Africa to electricity by 2030. That's a game changer. Now, in climate change, the G20 didn't exactly invent new targets, but it threw its collective weight behind the big ones. They forcefully recommitted to tripling renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. That's a huge signal for the global energy market.
Next up, they tackled the really tricky issue of critical minerals. The stuff that literally powers our modern world. Their solution? A new framework for sustainable supply chains. But, and this is a big but, it also protects the right of nations to use their own resources for their own growth. It's a real balancing act.
And on the social front, they updated a key goal. The new Brisbane eThekwini goal now aims to slash the gender gap in the workforce by a full 25% by 2030.
Okay, so all these agreements sound pretty good. But why should we care what these 20 countries decide? What really gives the G20 its global clout?
Well, the answer is right here. On one side, you've got the old school G7, a pretty small club of advanced economies. But on the other, you have the G20. It's bigger, and more importantly, it includes emerging powerhouses like the BRICS nations and now the entire African Union. That kind of diversity gives its decisions way more global legitimacy.
Think of the G20 as wearing a few different hats. It's the world's economic firefighter. Remember how it stepped in to prevent a global depression after 2008? It's also a reform champion, pushing old institutions like the World Bank to change with the times. And it's a global rule setter, shaping everything from international tax to digital infrastructure. But look, it's not all smooth sailing, not by a long shot. Despite all its power, the G20 is facing some of the most serious challenges in its entire history.
The headwinds are really strong. Geopolitical tensions mean that reaching a real consensus is just harder than ever, and you end up with these watered-down statements. When key leaders decide to skip a summit, it hurts the group's legitimacy. And maybe the biggest issue, its pledges are non-binding. So all those ambitious promises, they often get hit with massive delays, and there are no real consequences. It's basically a recipe for gridlock.
This is a perfect example of the problem. The G20 created this thing called the Common Framework for Debt Treatment. It was supposed to help heavily indebted countries restructure their loans. But in reality, it's been slammed for being so slow and so complicated that it just doesn't work as promised. The good ideas are getting lost in the bureaucracy.
And all of this leads to the central question for the G20's future, right? In a world that feels like it's fracturing, can a group that depends on everyone agreeing still be the world's main steering committee?
How the G20 answers that question is about so much more than just official statements and photo ops. The outcome of these challenges could really redefine global leadership for the next generation.
For emerging powers, this moment of tension is also a moment of massive opportunity. It's what they call a strategic inflection point. For countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa, who actually hold consecutive G20 presidencies, this is their chance. Their chance to go from just setting the agenda to actually shaping the rules of a new, more multipolar world.
And that leaves us with this final critical question. The G20 Summit in Africa put a spotlight on the rising influence of the global South. But as the old order frays and new powers rise, the biggest question of all is, in this fragmenting world, who is actually going to write the rules for the 21st century?